one of the most adored goddesses in Egyptian history, simply vanished. No final hymn, no royal decree, just silence. For centuries, Bastet was worshipped in grand festivals where thousands danced under oil-lit skies. Her image graced every household, her name whispered in both prayer and protection. Then suddenly nothing. Her temples emptied, her likeness softened, and the lioness who once defended the pharaohs became little more than a house cat in history books. Why would a goddess so loved be erased? And what truth lies behind that erasure? Questions like that don't scream. They murmur through broken hieroglyphs and cat-headed statues half swallowed by sand. So take a breath, let the dust settle, and listen closely to what still stirs in the ruins of her forgotten temples. In ancient Egypt, the divine walked among the living. Gods weren't distant, they had addresses. Bastet, the feline goddess of protection, was one of them. Her cult center at Bubastis pulsed with life festivals of music, perfume, and wine where worshippers came not in fear, but celebration. She protected homes, women, and children. She healed, she punished, she watched. But behind that warm feline gaze was something older, fiercer. Some said she was once a lioness of war, sharp-fanged and drenched in blood. Others believed she and her darker sister, Sekhmet, were one and the same, split in two for reasons still hidden. But then the papyri go quiet. The statues are moved. Her symbols start showing up where they shouldn't, or stop showing up at all. This wasn't neglect. This was erasure. Before we venture further into the shadows, take a moment to subscribe so you never miss a secret that history has tried to forget. You begin with an image Bastet seated gracefully, a cat-headed goddess cradling a sistrum in one hand and an ankh in the other. She's serene, maternal, almost domesticated. But dig a little deeper past the museum labels and soft figurines, and her earlier form comes roaring to life. Bastet was not always gentle. Once she bore the head of a lioness, her name associated with vengeance and raw divine fury. Her earliest depictions don't purr, they roar. In the Old Kingdom, references to Bastet often overlap with other leonine deities, Sekhmet, Tefnut, even Mafdet. These were not comforting goddesses. They were ferocious protectors, their role tied to bloodshed and solar vengeance. Bastet in this form was not your protector at the hearth. She was the goddess who defended Ra's solar bark each night from the serpent Apep. To protect meant to destroy. It was only much later that she appeared with the soft gaze of a house cat. This transformation wasn't incidental. It was political. During Egypt's Middle Kingdom, and especially under the 22nd dynasty, the Libyan-influenced period, Bastet's image softened. Pharaoh Shoshenq II, who moved his capital to Bubastis, elevated her cult dramatically. But the Bastet he promoted was no longer the fearsome lioness of earlier generations. She was now a goddess of fertility, music, and healing. The protector of mothers. The enemy of evil spirits, not armies. This shift aligned neatly with a broader campaign to centralize religious authority and soothe public anxiety during periods of dynastic instability. And a nurturing cat is far easier to worship than a blood-drenched predator. Yet traces of the older Bastet remained. Some temple reliefs from Bubastis show her holding a blade. Others associate her with violent festivals, suggesting her softer mask never fully covered the older face. This duality hints at a compromise between the royal narrative and the memories of her priesthood. Perhaps they couldn't entirely erase her original nature, so they split the story instead. Here's where things get even murkier. In Theban traditions, Sekhmet, another lion-headed goddess, is cast as the uncontainable wrath of Ra. She's the destroyer, the punisher, the plague bringer. And yet some hymns use the names Bastet and Sekhmet interchangeably, as if they are two moods of the same divine being. Bastet in this light is Sekhmet pacified. Some scholars suggest this theological bifurcation was deliberate and ancient strategy to channel public fear into worship of a more manageable deity. You couldn't always pray to the lioness, but you could always leave milk out for the cat. But here's the problem with that theory. In places like Saqqara and Memphis, Bastet is shown alongside Sekhmet not as a replacement. They weren't a single goddess split, they were sisters, allies, perhaps even rivals. And if that's true, the shift from warrior to nurturer wasn't about softening one goddess. It was about drawing a line in the sand between two powers that once overlapped. One controversial interpretation even suggests that Bastet's transformation was engineered not to protect the people, but to protect the state. By channeling public devotion toward a more passive, comforting image of divine femininity, the ruling class could mute the more chaotic, vengeful dimensions of goddess worship that threatened social order. A gentle protector inspires trust. A lioness inspires fear. And sometimes fear breeds revolt. And then there's the feline question. Why a cat? Why in the land of falcon-headed sky gods and crocodile-limbed creators did Bastet become a cat? At all, domestic cats were not always part of Egyptian life. But by the New Kingdom, they had become cherished members of households valued for their grace, cunning, and ability to destroy vermin, both literal and symbolic. A cat could be playful, or deadly affectionate, or aloof. In a way, it was the perfect divine metaphor, protective, unpredictable, sacred. Bastet was a goddess people could both worship and welcome into their homes. A lion may watch from the wild, but a cat sleeps beside your children. And yet this domestic turn isn't as benign as it sounds. Beneath the soft fur and temple music lies an unsettling truth: a war goddess had been rewritten. A deity of sharp justice and divine fire was edited into something more palatable. The question is, who did the editing and what were they trying to protect? Perhaps that's why her image lingers in so many forms. Carvings that contradict each other. Hymns that celebrate healing one moment and bloodletting the next. She was transformed, yes, but never entirely tamed. Somewhere behind that contented gaze is the memory of teeth. You follow the Nile eastward, where it splits and weaves like fingers reaching into the delta. Here, half buried beneath farmland and clustered villages, lie the remains of Bubastis, the sacred city once crowned by the Temple of Bastet. In its prime, it was said to rival even Karnak in glory. Travelers marveled at the way light played off its red granite pillars, and Herodotus, always ready with a touch of exaggeration, claimed its annual festival was the most joyous in all of Egypt. But today, you'd walk right past it. There's little to see above ground now. A few weathered blocks, fragments of reliefs, and a broken gateway nearly lost to weeds. But beneath the soil, archaeologists have uncovered something stranger than mere ruins. The temple's foundations reveal a history riddled with interruptions, phases of construction, demolition, rebuilding. Layers that suggest Bastet's house was not just expanded or restored, but altered, repeatedly, as if someone was trying to rewrite the memory in stone. The earliest phase of the temple dates back to the Old Kingdom, though traces of Bastet's worship here may go back even further. But it was during the 22nd dynasty, under Pharaoh Osorkon II, that the temple reached its zenith. He poured wealth into its construction, not just for piety's sake, but for power. Elevating Bastet's cult meant elevating Bubastis, his home city. It was a political move disguised as religious devotion, and it worked, for a time. But then the decline began. Successive rulers moved their capitals elsewhere. Bastet's temple fell into neglect. The sacred lake dried. And in one curious layer, archaeologists found evidence of deliberate desecration: altars, toppled statues, beheaded inscriptions, scratched into near oblivion. This wasn't erosion, it was intention. The question is why one theory points to shifting religious currents. As Isis rose in popularity, so too did the cults that surrounded her, more cosmopolitan, more adaptable to Greco-Roman tastes. Bastet tied so intimately to the Egyptian household, and the native pantheon may have been seen as provincial, outdated, too local for an empire now flirting with Rome and Athens. Another idea, more controversial, suggests that Bastet's temple became the center of resistance during a time of foreign control. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans, they all passed through Egypt's corridors. And during each occupation, temples became more than sacred sites. They became symbols of national identity. Bastet, once tamed into a domestic icon, may have returned to her older form in secret rituals. Not just the protector of households, but of Egypt itself. Some fragments from the later strata support this. Small votive offerings, cat figurines with inscriptions hastily scratched into their bases, plead not for blessings or fertility, but for vengeance, for protection against invaders. One even names the ones who came from across the sea, a phrase eerily similar to how some native texts referred to the Greeks. And then there's the matter of the missing statues. Osorkon's temple once held dozens, perhaps hundreds of Bastet sculptures in both feline and human animal form. But today, only a handful remain. Some were clearly looted. Others, curiously, were buried within the temple complex itself. Not lost, hidden, as if by priests trying to preserve something no longer safe in daylight. There's one particular artifact that scholars still argue over. A shattered limestone panel found near the outer gate shows Bastet flanked not by cats, but by lions. Her face is soft, but her posture is combative, and beneath her feet are enemies bound in chains. It's not a peaceful image. It's a warning, and it raises a thorny question. Was this the true Bastet glimpsed briefly through the political fog? And if so, did those who built the later, softer temple do so to suppress this older version, or to keep it contained? You can almost see it now. A festival crowd dancing and laughing as perfumed oil glistens on the paving stones. But somewhere in the shadows of the sanctuary, a hidden chamber. A lioness statue facing east away from the light, incense curling in secret. Words whispered too softly for the gods to hear. It's hard to know what truly happened in Bubastis. The Nile has changed course and much of the city lies under water or under fields. But one thing is clear. Bastet's temple was more than a place of worship. It was a battlefield of memory. A place where gods were reshaped not by time, but by choice. You've seen her twin already lurking in the margins of myths and temple walls. Sekhmet, the lioness whose breath birthed the desert wind, whose fury once nearly ended humanity. Where Bastet's gaze is warm, Sekhmet's burns. And yet in hymn after hymn, relief after relief, they blur. Sisters, mirrors, or perhaps masks of one being. The question that haunts scholars isn't whether they're connected, but who came first and why that mattered. Ancient Egyptian religion wasn't rigid. Gods merged, diverged, and changed depending on politics, region, and ritual need. But Bastet and Sekhmet present a uniquely tangled case. In some Theban texts, Sekhmet is the lioness of the south, while Bastet guards the north. This geographical division seems straightforward until you find temple records in Memphis that show them worshipped together in the same precinct. Not as opposites, not as enemies, as two halves of a singular divine strategy, one to destroy, one to protect. Both feline, both dangerous. The earliest texts, dating back to the Pyramid Age, feature only fleeting references to Bastet, but Sekhmet is already well established. She is the Eye of Ra, the Punisher unleashed when humanity disobeys divine order. In one infamous myth, Ra sends Sekhmet to slaughter mankind, only to regret his decision when her rage proves uncontainable. To stop her, he tricks her into drinking red-dyed beer, calming her into a different state. Some interpret that moment as her transformation into Bastet. It's a neat story, satisfying, but too neat perhaps, because while it's tempting to view Bastet as Sekhmet tamed, their worship grew in parallel. Bastet's cult at Bubastis surged even as Sekhmet retained her place in Memphis and Thebes. They served different roles: Sekhmet in healing Bastet in childbirth, Sekhmet in war, Bastet in music, but their iconography often overlapped. Both wielded knives. Both bore solar discs. In some reliefs, Bastet is shown with the lioness head again, especially in earlier dynasties. It's not a transformation, it's a recursion, a memory that refused to be buried. One particularly intriguing clue comes from a minor temple inscription in Leontopolis long overlooked. It refers to Bastet as she who comes when Sekhmet sleeps, not as her descendant, not even as her opposite, as her consequence. That phrasing, however poetic, has sparked furious debate. Was Bastet a balm created in the wake of divine wrath? Or was she always there, waiting beneath the surface of Sekhmet's fury, the softness in the eye of the storm? Now step into the shoes of a royal priest. Imagine the tightrope you'd have to walk when managing the dual worship of these two entities. You can't promote only Sekhmet too much fear. You can't ignore her too much risk. But Bastet could be elevated as the gentle counterpart, the accessible goddess of home and joy. The same power in a softer skin. It's a theological move with political genius. But what happens when the public begins to prefer the cat to the lioness? When temples of Bastet grow larger, her festivals wilder, her image more widespread, a shift begins. The rulers of the north use Bastet to consolidate control, emphasizing harmony over punishment. The south responds with a deepening devotion to Sekhmet, drawing sharper lines between mercy and judgment. Some have argued this tension reflected real political divides: Lower Egypt versus Upper Egypt, Libyan dynasties versus Theban orthodoxy. And in this battle of divine sisters, theology became proxy war. And then, the lines blur again. Under the Ptolemies, foreign rulers who cloaked themselves in pharaonic legitimacy, both Bastet and Sekhmet were retained, but diluted. Sekhmet became more abstract, associated with general destruction rather than specific wrath. Bastet, meanwhile, was increasingly paired with Greek deities like Artemis or Hecate, not because they matched, but because it was convenient. Their ancient rivalry, if it was a rivalry, dissolved into cultural paperwork. But even here, echoes remain. Small artifacts, amulets found buried with commoners sometimes invoke both names, as if ordinary people unsure of which sister would answer chose to whisper to both. And so we return to the earlier question. Were Bastet and Sekhmet truly two beings? Or was one created to contain the other? If Bastet was born from the need to temper fury with grace, does that make her less authentic or more necessary? The record doesn't say. But it leaves us something better than certainty, a trail of contradiction. Lion and cat, wrath and comfort, day and dusk. And maybe, just maybe, that was the point, that the goddess was never meant to be understood, only worshipped. You find yourself inside the silence of a temple archive, real or imagined, doesn't matter. The air is dry, heavy with centuries of incense and whispered prayers. The papyrus scrolls stacked in niches around you aren't loud with secrets. They're quiet with omission. Because what isn't written about Bastet sometimes tells us more than what is. In Egypt's temple, economy records were everything. Deeds, offerings, festivals, omens, all catalogued with meticulous care by scribes trained to observe not just divine will, but political shifts. And somewhere in those records, the goddess Bastet begins to stutter. Not disappear exactly, but flicker. In some scrolls, she's the Lady of the East, her name surrounded by praise and petitions. In others, she's noted only in passing, her titles reduced, her rites abbreviated. A festival once spanning 5 days becomes 3, then 1, then none. One document from the reign of Psamtik shows her mentioned only in relation to Sekhmet's wrath, an afterthought, a modifier. Another from a later Ptolemaic period describes her as the joy-bringer of the household, stripped of any martial or protective attributes. And yet in the same archive, a barely legible annotation appears in the margin. She guards the eye when the son is wounded. No context, no explanation. Just that. A scratched fragment left like a fingerprint. This is where things turn. Because while public records trend toward reduction, private texts tell another story. Personal letters, graffiti in tomb walls, even ostraca from workmen's villages show Bastet invoked for protection, not just from harm, but from betrayal, from invasion, from unseen evil. In one faded script, may Bastet slit the throat of the liar. Not exactly your cozy hearth goddess. The lioness, it seems, never entirely left the room. And then there's the Saqqara anomaly. In the 1960s, archaeologists excavating a priest's tomb near Saqqara found a scroll unlike any other in its time. It detailed a ritual dedicated to Bastet, involving 7 knives, a bowl of moonbled milk, and a warning not to perform it in the sight of those who honor the falcon. The falcon, of course, being Horus, the state-backed deity of kingship and solar order. Why would a Bastet ritual be performed in secrecy under the threat of punishment from those aligned with the central order? Some scholars interpret this as evidence of a theological schism, a split not just in worship but in ideology. Bastet, long treated as a goddess of balance and nurturing, may have become a symbol of dissent. Of older traditions the state no longer favored, of powers that couldn't be controlled. A high priest's diary written during the waning years of native Egyptian rule offers a final haunting clue. Among lists of standard temple expenses and ritual observations is a single sentence underlined twice. We do not speak her name where they can hear. Who were they? Foreign governors, Ptolemaic officials, rival priesthoods? The text never clarifies. But the fear is palpable. Not of Bastet, but of what invoking her might mean. And this brings us to a contradiction too sharp to ignore. Bastet was one of the most popular deities of the late period. Her cat-headed statues multiplied. Amulets bearing her likeness were exported across the Mediterranean. Her image was everywhere. And yet, the priesthood whispered. The scribes redacted. The scrolls softened her until she was barely recognizable. Could it be that her popularity became her danger? When a goddess belongs to the people, when she walks into every home, blesses every birth, guards every threshold, she stops being the state's. She becomes a force not of kingship, but of community. And in volatile times, community can become resistance. You don't need an army if your goddess lives in every household. You need only whisper. By the time the Romans arrived, most temple complexes had been gutted, scrolls burned or buried. The scribal tradition collapsed into fragments. Bastet's name remained, But the stories attached to her grew gentler, smaller, safer. The lioness, hidden behind the cat, had finally been caged, but not destroyed. Because in the surviving texts, those passed from scribe to apprentice priest to initiate, she remains half seen. A mother, yes, but also a hunter. A whisper between scroll lines. A name not written but known. Step carefully now. The stones of Thebes aren't quiet. They hum. Beneath the sun-blasted ruins and sand-choked alleyways of what was once Egypt's spiritual heart, something lingers, something less refined than doctrine and more urgent than prayer. If Bubastis was Bastet's sanctuary, Thebes was where her shadow stirred, not in golden processions or sanctioned hymns, but in defiant rituals held by torchlight. This wasn't state worship. It was something rawer, more dangerous. The official records barely mention Bastet here. She wasn't part of Thebes's dominant theological pantheon. Amun Mut Khonsu, these were the crowned names. Yet Bastet appears in graffiti and broken statuary, hidden beneath other altars in layers of soot that shouldn't be there. She's scratched into limestone with fingers instead of chisels. She's scrawled into walls where she had no official business being. And that tells you one thing: someone brought her here when they weren't supposed to. It begins around the Third Intermediate Period, a time when Thebes was fracturing under its own weight. Rival priesthoods and royal claimants fought not with swords, but with symbols. And here Bastet's reappearance becomes political. In periods of civic unrest, particularly during the rebellions against the high priests of Amun, evidence suggests Bastet was invoked by factions resisting centralized religious control. It wasn't just about theology, it was about autonomy. Bastet wasn't only the goddess of protection, she became the symbol of a city's right to protect itself. One Ostrakhan fragment found near the workers' village of Deir el-Medina speaks volumes. It reads, "We wear the claw beneath the robe." The claw, Bastet's mark. Some interpret this as metaphor courage hidden beneath obedience. Others, more controversially, believe it was literal, that Bastet's symbols, her rites, even her prayers were practiced in secret among those who could no longer trust Thebes's official gods to protect them. During the Kushite period, when foreign rulers restored some degree of order to Thebes, the Bastet markings become more frantic, less careful. Statues with lioness heads are decapitated, sometimes hastily buried. But her name continues to appear, especially among midwives and embalmers, those who moved at the margins of power, who dealt with beginnings and endings alike. In this light, Bastet wasn't just a goddess of home and hearth. She was the protector of those who lived outside the palace walls. And then comes the fire. In a layer of ash dated to the late 7th century BCE, excavators found remains of a small shrine wedged into the foundation of a larger temple likely dedicated to Mut. Inside were burned cat bones, shattered wine jars, and a sistrum melted nearly beyond recognition. This was no accident. This was purging. Someone wanted that shrine erased. But the curious part isn't the destruction, it's the reconstruction. Because a generation later in the same spot, another set of offerings appears. Calmer, cleaner. As if the ritual had returned quiet and patient long after the authorities looked away. So what do you make of that? One line of thinking sees Bastet here as a relic of older faiths desperately clinging to relevance in a city that never fully accepted her. Another view, less academic, more whispered, sees her as a goddess of revolution. Not the fiery upheaval of Sekhmet, but the slow, persistent kind. The kind that curls at your feet and waits for the right moment to strike. This is where the callbacks begin to whisper. The graffiti in Thebes echoes the marginalia from Saqqara. The secret rituals match the forgotten rites described near Bubastis. The defiance in scrolls mirrors the silence in temples. Different cities, different centuries, same patterns. Bastet invoked not in majesty, but in resistance. She didn't march with armies, she slinked between footsteps, gathering loyalty where it mattered most in the homes, the kitchens, the cradles. And isn't that the cleverest rebellion of all, to be present where no one expects you? To survive not through power, but proximity. While great gods rose and fell with dynasties, Bastet made herself essential to ordinary life. She was the one you prayed to when your child was sick, when your home was threatened, when your trust in kings dissolved. In Thebes, the rebellion wasn't loud. It was whispered, hidden behind closed doors, scribbled in a hand trembling with both fear and faith. And in those whispers, Bastet became something more than myth. She became memory's ally, resistance made divine. Now the air changes. The sun no longer rises to the chant of native priests, but to the clipped syllables of Greek. The rhythms of Egypt bend first subtly, then completely, as foreign boots settle deeper into its soil. The Ptolemies Greeks in Pharaoh's clothing were clever in many things, and chief among them was how to inherit a religion without provoking it. They didn't dismantle Egypt's pantheon. Not at first. They translated it. For Bastet, this meant survival, but at a cost. The early Ptolemies recognized her popularity. Festivals still drew thousands. Her likeness still sold. Bubastis still echoed with distant prayers. But instead of restoring her as a lioness or a war goddess, they leaned into her domestic form, gentle, musical, maternal. In this softened state, she could be likened to Artemis the Greek huntress, or even Hecate with her midnight guardianship and affinity for thresholds. But these weren't one-to-one translations. They were approximations, smooth surfaces over jagged memories. In this way, Bastet didn't vanish under foreign rule. She became legible to the occupiers, digestible, Hellenized. But there are problems with translation. Some meanings don't survive the journey. Take, for instance, the case of the bilingual stele. These inscribed stones, written in both Greek and Demotic, often reference Bastet as the Lady of the Temple or Mistress of the House of Joy. Gone are the blood rites, the protective spells, the lion's ferocity. In their place, dance fertility music. The claws retracted, the roar quieted, yet the people remembered. Buried deep in the catacombs under Alexandria are walls etched with feline figures, not dainty pets, but fierce, wide-eyed cats with sharpened ears and raised tails. Some have tiny spears carved beside them. Others sit atop broken serpents. These weren't Artemis's creatures. These were watchful guardians. And while no official scroll claims these were depictions of Bastet, their location far from temple oversight suggests otherwise. Memory had moved underground. It's here we find a curious tension. Bastet's iconography was co-opted, yes, but she didn't entirely dissolve. Coins from the Ptolemaic period sometimes bore her face stylized and serene. Cat mummies were still mass-produced, though now more for tourists and temple economics than for actual belief. Statues still traveled, names still echoed. But beneath the surface, she was slipping. One Roman governor, writing in a private letter unearthed in Oxyrhynchus, complained of the women of the river towns who sing to the cat and call her their queen. His tone was annoyed, dismissive, but also uneasy. Even in an empire that worshipped emperors, local gods still held sway. And Bastet reduced, though she was refused to vanish. And yet even the Romans had their limits. As Christianity swept across Egypt, temples closed. The final bastions of native worship, the old sanctuaries of the gods, were shuttered or burned. In this purge, Bastet was not targeted as a threat. She simply wasn't important enough anymore. No lioness remained to fear. Just a whisper of a cat purring in old songs no longer sung. But here's the strange part. Even as her religious function declined, her image survived. Not in worship, but in superstition. In medieval Coptic texts, references to the cat demoness appear sometimes feared, sometimes revered. One tale tells of a woman who prayed to the Virgin and left milk at her doorway for protection. When asked why, she replied, "Because the cat still watches." No name given, just the cat, still watching. Some scholars dismiss these stories as folklore remnants of older traditions blurred by time. Others see them as proof that Bastet evolved beyond the bounds of state cult and temple rite. She became something older than dogma, a presence, a symbol, a face that remained even when the name was lost. This brings us full circle to Bubastis. In the Roman era, travelers still visited its ruins. Some chipped pieces of her temple away for souvenirs. One scratched a Latin phrase into the wall, "She waits in the dust." Maybe it was poetic flair. Or maybe they knew what we suspect now, that Bastet didn't die or even disappear. She adapted. She went where no empire could erase her, into story superstition and the silent corners of the world where memory hides. So was her absence erasure or evolution? Did the conquerors overwrite her story or simply give her new disguises? The scrolls can't answer. But the carvings persist. The cats still prowl the ruins, and the goddess who once roared now waits quietly, like all things that know how to return. You smell them before you see them. The catacombs of Saqqara, dark and narrow, stretch like veins beneath the sands. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of age, of linen, of oils long faded, and bones. Thousands of mummified cats, wrapped, stacked, offered. It feels sacred, yes, but also obsessive, as if someone was trying to remember too much, too fast. These cat necropolises weren't accidental. They were built, maintained, and at their height commercialized. Pilgrims journeyed from across Egypt to offer mummified cats in Bastet's name, not just as tribute, but as petition, protection, fertility, vengeance. And while the official line was one of piety, the scale raises eyebrows. At Tuna El Gebel alone, over 4 million mummified animals have been discovered, most of them cats. But here's the twist. Many of these mummies, when scanned, reveal not full cats, but bundles of bones, straw, or clay. Some don't contain any remains at all. They were fakes, mass-produced offerings sold to desperate worshippers. A theological souvenir shop posing as devotion. So what was really happening here? Some argue it was economic, a way for temple precincts to maintain income during lean political times. Others believe it was spiritual desperation. A society losing faith in kings and priests but still needing something to pray to. Bastet, as the goddess of the home, required no temple, only a token. A cat, real or symbolic, to carry the plea. One 1st century BCE funerary text recovered near Bubastis includes a peculiar passage: "Wrap her likeness thrice, place her in the west, and speak no more of war." It doesn't specify who she is, but the instructions resemble those found in tombs filled with feline bundles, suggesting that Bastet was invoked not only in life, but in death. As a guardian between worlds, as a barrier against chaos, both the spiritual kind and the political. And then come the anomalies. In a minor tomb west of Abydos, archaeologists found a sealed chamber untouched by looters. Inside, among standard funerary artifacts, were 23 cat mummies, all wrapped with blue linen and expensive dye, and each with a tiny carnelian bead tied to its neck. No inscriptions, no prayers. But nearby, etched into a clay jar, were the words, "For the lioness who hears without being called." That line doesn't match any known hymn. It's not standard temple language, which means it may be something rarer, a secret prayer passed hand to hand, hidden from those who would censor it. Could these cults have operated in parallel to the state, or worse, in defiance of it? Some believe so. The scale of cat burials suggests not just faith, but obsession. That Bastet had become more than a goddess, she was a mediator, a shield. In eras where politics failed and foreign gods claimed dominion, she remained accessible, familiar. She lived in homes, in alleyways, in whispers. You didn't need a priest to reach her, just a cat. And therein lies the danger. Decentralized belief cannot be controlled. These tomb cults, small and scattered though they seem, were unified by something profound: trust in Bastet, to hear what others wouldn't. When no other god seemed to listen, when no king seemed to protect, when no scroll recorded your name. By the Roman period, temple rituals had grown more theatrical than sacred, and yet these feline offerings continued often in the most remote necropolises, a kind of silent resistance through devotion. The more the state forgot her, the more people buried her likeness in stone, straw, and scent. It's a paradox: the less visible Bastet became, the more her shadow spread. One tomb wall in Com Ombo, scrawled in fading demotic script, bears a final clue. She walks behind the dead, and none dare follow. It's not comforting. It's not maternal. It's the voice of the lioness again, unseen, untamed, guarding something too sacred to be spoken aloud. And you remember the buried statues at Bubastis, the muttered prayers in Thebes, the forbidden rituals in Saqqara. They weren't isolated. They were pieces of something larger, a network of memory, of reverence unapproved. So why did Bastet disappear from history books? Maybe she didn't. Maybe she just moved underground. And maybe that was always her domain. You won't find them on official rosters or in temple registers. Their names don't survive in scrolls, and their titles were never carved in stone. But they existed, those last guardians of Bastet. Not priests in golden headdresses, not pharaoh's appointed clergy. These were ordinary people, midwives, healers, weavers, women mostly, some men. The quiet sort who tended flame and memory long after the gods had been chased from the temples. The fall of Bastet wasn't like a war. It wasn't a single day of icon smashing or a decree from Rome. It was slower, quieter. Like watching light drain from a room as the shutters are drawn one by one. First the festivals were shortened, then the prayers were softened. Then she was equated with Artemis, then diminished to symbol, then omitted entirely. And yet the flame remained small, flickering, hidden in places no census ever reached. You see it in the amulets, the ones found in burial sites centuries after Bastet's last sanctioned rite. They're carved with a peculiar care, simple but deliberate. Some bear her traditional symbols, the sistrum, the ankh, the lioness tail. Others show her not at all, just a cat in mid-step, tail, raised eyes alert. But the purpose was the same: protection. Not for empires, for bodies, for births, for secrets. In a crumbling village on the edge of the desert, one archaeologist found a clay bowl with the words, "For her who watches," pressed into the base, not painted, but etched with a finger before the clay dried. It wasn't the language of temple formalism. It was personal, unfiltered, and deeply familiar. Whoever made it wasn't offering to a metaphor. They were feeding someone they still believed could answer. The last of her formal priests may have been forced to renounce her. There are fragmentary accounts of temple conversions, of scrolls burned or buried, of forced baptisms. And yet those who had known her kept something alive, not in defiance, but in rhythm. The rhythm of the home, of daily rites, of whispered names after nightfall. It wasn't just in Egypt. In the far reaches of the Mediterranean, symbols appear that seem out of place, feline motifs on Roman pendants, eyes shaped not in the style of Horus, but slanted and sharp like a cat's. Some believe these are coincidental. Others suspect they are traces, fragments of a belief system so deeply internalized, it bled beyond borders. A goddess turned folk memory, a protective presence that didn't need temples to survive. One theory, quiet, controversial, but persistent, suggests that some of Bastet's last devotees encoded her rites into domestic rituals. That songs sung to babies at night retained the cadence of ancient prayers. That household charms were placed near doors and windows, not just for luck, but for guarding. It's the sort of thing scholars roll their eyes at in the light of day and quietly scribble into the margins of their notebooks at night, because something about Bastet resists finality. She wasn't just worshipped, she was woven into music, into scent, into the movement of a cat brushing against your leg as you pass through a threshold. And maybe that's the point. She didn't need saving, she was the one doing the saving. And those who kept her memory, who never bowed to new gods or tore down their own beliefs to survive, weren't trying to preserve history. They were trying to preserve protection, a presence, a being who could not be killed because she was never born in stone to begin with. The last guardians weren't chosen, they were chosen by her. And they carried her not in titles or temples, but in the body's quiet memory of comfort and watchfulness. In the unseen spaces between danger and safety. In the breath you take when you realize something has passed in the night and left you untouched. She is still invoked even now when someone lights a candle and says nothing. When someone places milk at a threshold, not because they believe, but because something in them remembers. The last guardians are never truly the last. There's always one more watcher, one more whisper. And in that whisper, Bastet breathes. There's a stillness now. The trail has been walked, the temples revisited, the scrolls unrolled, and yet the air remains thick with something unsaid. Bastet, lioness and house cat, goddess and guardian, has led us in circles, from grandeur to shadow, from worship to whisper, and you wonder, what remains? Not statues. Most have crumbled or been scattered across museum halls. Not festivals. Those songs haven't echoed in millennia. Not scripture. Her name was written in ink and ink fades. But memory has claws. It doesn't vanish. It settles, waits, and returns when it's needed most. So what does Bastet's journey truly reveal? Perhaps it tells us that power once dressed in armor and fire can slip into fur and silence without losing its edge. That protection doesn't always shout. Sometimes it waits behind closed doors. Sometimes it's a soft presence at the foot of the bed, guarding without ceremony. Bastet didn't fall. She adapted. When politics demanded peace, she became joy. When temples fell, she moved into homes. When names changed, she answered anyway. And perhaps in the end, that is the greatest kind of divinity, not the one that reigns from high thrones, but the one that survives in silence. The one we carry not because we must, but because we choose to remember. Now rest. The lioness is watching. The night is calm.